The storage unit released my archived film negatives to someone else. I found out because the front desk emailed a receipt showing my unit cleared and marked vacant. The pickup name wasn't mine. I drove there without calling ahead. The unit was empty. Cleaned. The light worked. The shelves were bare where the boxes used to sit, each one labeled in my handwriting, years of commission work and personal projects. The clerk said everything had been authorized. He said the paperwork was in order. He said the man had been polite. I met him because of those boxes. He appeared 2 days earlier at a gallery opening where one of my older pieces was on a sidewall, not the main show. I hadn't even known it was hung. He was standing close to it when I walked in, hands behind his back, reading the caption carefully. When he turned, he told me which camera I'd used. Not the model, the lens. He said it like a fact, not a flex. He didn't ask for my card. He told me he was archiving a small private collection and had been trying to trace provenance on a few works that circulated without context. He said my name came up more than once. He said it without praise, like a relief. I left early that night. He didn't follow. The next morning, he emailed me through the gallery. He attached a scan of one of my images from a decade ago, cropped wrong, flattened, stripped of its margins. He asked if I still had the original negative. He asked because he wanted to fix it. I said I did. He asked if he could see how I stored them, not to handle anything, just to understand my system so he wouldn't waste my time later. He offered to bring gloves. He brought his own light. At the storage facility, he stood back while I opened boxes. He didn't touch. He asked me to show him how I labeled what I considered finished versus raw. He noticed inconsistencies I'd never corrected because they were mine. He said he could help me standardize without changing the work. He didn't stay long. He didn't take photos. When he left, he emailed a list of questions that showed he'd been paying attention. He started stopping by when I was there anyway. Sometimes with a coffee I hadn't ordered. Sometimes just to return a sleeve I'd lent him. He never asked for keys. He never asked for access. He asked for permission each time, even when the answer was obvious. I let him digitize one roll as a test. He brought it back the next day, better than the version I'd been living with. He didn't watermark it. He didn't keep a copy. He asked if I wanted the color profile saved or reset. Felt careful. Felt rare. We slept together after he helped me rebox a set I'd been avoiding because it meant revisiting a year I didn't like to open. He didn't ask about it. He taped the corners so they wouldn't bow. In the morning, he labeled the outside exactly the way I would have, including my shorthand. Later, he suggested I consolidate units. He said it was inefficient to pay twice. He offered to coordinate the move because he was already insured for transport. He said he'd handle the forms so I wouldn't have to stand in line again. I signed where he pointed, my hand still smelling like Fixer, because it was easier than doing it later. That's how the unit was released. By the time I stood in the empty space, the work was already somewhere else, cataloged by someone who knew my system well enough to speak for me. He told me where the boxes were before I asked. Not the address. The condition. Climate controlled. Logged. Insured under his policy. He said it in a text that ended with a question about whether I preferred archival sleeves or glassine going forward. I didn't respond right away. I drove back to the storage facility instead and asked the clerk who'd signed for the release. He showed me the authorization on the screen. My name. My handwriting scanned. A box check that I didn't remember checking. I'd signed because he'd said it would save me a second trip. When I told him what the clerk had said, he didn't argue. He said the system defaulted to full release if consolidation was selected. He said it was reversible. He said he'd already started the intake so nothing would be misplaced. That word again. Careful words. Reversible. Intake. He invited me to see the new space that evening. Not as a defense. As an update. It was a converted warehouse with high windows and white walls that didn't try to be charming. My boxes were stacked by year. Exactly as I described them, only tighter. Cleaner. Each one had a new tag with my shorthand typed instead of handwritten. It was my system, just more legible. He didn't wait for praise. He showed me the logbook, every movement time-stamped. He pointed out where I could initial changes if I wanted. He said most artists didn't, but the option was there. Felt like control without effort. After that, things moved quickly without feeling rushed. He digitized more roles, always bringing them back before I asked. He sent side-by-side comparisons but never told me which was better. He asked. When I chose the version that stayed closer to the flaws, he adjusted his presets accordingly. He started introducing me to people. A conservator who asked my opinion before touching anything. A collector who wanted context, not a price. He stayed quiet during those conversations. When they left, he asked if I wanted to follow up or let it sit. I stopped carrying the keys to the warehouse. He had them. He was already there most days. We slept together more regularly then. Not with urgency. With routine. I left clothes there without thinking about it. He made space without announcing it. When I stayed over, he woke before me and worked silently at the desk, headphones on, careful not to open drawers I hadn't labeled. One night, he asked if I wanted him listed as the primary contact for the archive, just so institutions wouldn't bother me with logistics. He said my name would remain on everything. He said it would reduce noise. I said maybe. He didn't follow up. He kept doing what he'd been doing. 2 weeks later, a museum emailed him instead of me with a request. He forwarded it, already drafted a response, and asked if I approved. I said yes. He sent it. After that, approvals became summaries. Summaries became notifications. When I asked if he needed anything formal from me to streamline things, he said only if I wanted to. He said there was a standard form that allowed him to act as custodian for transport and handling. He said it didn't change ownership. He said it expired annually unless renewed. He printed it and left it on the table while he cooked. I signed because the pen was there and because the next step felt smaller than going back. Later that night, he told me he'd turned down a project because it conflicted with my schedule. He said it casually, like it was obvious. I didn't correct him. The archive felt safer than it ever had. Quieter. Less exposed to my moods and delays. When I thought about the boxes now, I pictured them where he'd put them, not where I'd lost track of them. That seemed like progress. The formality came disguised as protection. He told me one morning that an institution had requested a temporary loan of several negatives for a private review. Not an exhibition. Not public. He said it was an opportunity to establish provenance cleanly and quietly. He said the request had come because the archive now looked organized enough to trust. He asked if I wanted to be involved in the handling. I said no. I said I trusted him. He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. He brought me coffee later that day and showed me the transport plan. Foam inserts. Climate logs. Courier chain. He pointed out where my name would appear on the documentation and where his would, smaller, as custodian. He said it mattered for insurance that one person was operationally responsible. He didn't ask me to sign anything then. Instead, he asked if I'd noticed how much lighter I'd been moving lately. He said I didn't flinch when someone mentioned my older work anymore. He said distance had done that, not avoidance. I didn't argue. We spent the weekend together without touching the archive at all. We cooked. We walked. He listened while I talked through a project I'd abandoned years ago. He didn't suggest reviving it. He suggested resequencing it. He said one change would unlock the rest. On Sunday night, he asked if I'd ever thought about what would happen to the work if something happened to me. Not dramatically. Logistically. He said most archives fell apart not because of loss but because of confusion. I told him I hadn't planned anything formal. He said that was common. He said it didn't need to be complicated. Just clarity. On Tuesday, he placed a document next to my laptop before leaving for a meeting. He didn't mention it. He didn't highlight anything. He just said he'd be back in an hour. It was a custodial agreement. Temporary, renewable. It allowed him to act independently in matters of transport, digitization, and third-party access. It stated clearly that ownership remained with me. It also stated that custodial decisions, once executed, could not be reversed retroactively. It looked reasonable. When he came back, I asked one question. I asked what would happen if we stopped working together. He said the archive would continue under the same structure until reassigned. He said reassignment required continuity approval to avoid gaps. He said that was standard. I signed because it sounded like maintenance, not commitment. That afternoon, the museum confirmed receipt of the negatives. They CC'd him, not me. He forwarded the email with a brief note saying everything had arrived safely and that the condition reports matched his expectations. He didn't ask if I wanted to see them. I realized later that evening that I no longer knew exactly where every box was. I knew the system. I trusted the system. But I hadn't touched the boxes myself in weeks. He started traveling after that. Short trips. Always with notice. Always with updates. He sent photos of crates sealed properly. He sent screenshots of logs. He told me when something had moved and when it hadn't. I didn't go with him. He said there was no need. When I tried to schedule time at the warehouse, the calendar showed limited availability. I asked him why. He said overlapping access created risk. He said it was safer if one person handled physical movement at a time. He said it was temporary. The midpoint arrived without ceremony. An institution published a private catalog referencing the archive curated and maintained by, and then his name. Mine appeared later. Smaller. In parentheses. When I asked him about it, he said that was a formatting decision on their end. He said the work was still mine. He said this was what credibility looked like. And I believed him because by then the archive no longer felt like something I owned. It felt like something that was being run. After that catalog appeared, people stopped asking me questions. They asked him. Emails came addressed to the archive, not to me. When I was copied, it was as an afterthought, a courtesy. He answered quickly, cleanly, without checking in first. When I mentioned it, he said speed mattered more than attribution at that level. He said institutions trusted consistency. He started using language I didn't recognize as ours. Phrases like standard handling and established protocol. When I asked to see the condition reports from the museum, he sent summaries instead of files. When I asked again, he said the originals were stored with the insurer, and that pulling them disrupted the chain. He wasn't rude. He was efficient. I tried to visit the warehouse without telling him. The access code didn't work. I stood there longer than I needed to, rereading the instructions on the door. When I texted him, he replied that overlapping access had already been scheduled that day, and he didn't want to risk contamination. He said we could plan a visit together next week. Next week didn't come. He traveled more. Longer trips. He sent fewer photos. When I asked where a specific series was, he told me the city, not the shelf. He said the details were logged. He said I didn't need to carry all of it anymore. We stopped sleeping together without deciding to. I stayed at my place more. He stayed at the warehouse or wherever the work was. When we did see each other, it was brief and tidy. Meals eaten quickly. Conversations that ended with him checking his phone. One evening, I found a draft press release saved in a shared folder I didn't remember agreeing to share. It described an upcoming private viewing. My name was listed under artist. His was listed under archive director. I asked him if that title was new. He said it was temporary. He said it helped with positioning. He said titles didn't change substance. I didn't argue. I asked him to move my name above his. He said that wasn't how hierarchies worked in that context. The next day, a courier arrived at my apartment with a single framed print. One of mine. He'd selected it for a donor preview. He hadn't told me. It was already matted, already insured, already assigned a return date. I hung it because it was easier than asking where it would go otherwise. I started noticing gaps. Roles I couldn't account for mentally. Projects I'd forgotten because I'd let him remember them for me. When I asked for a full inventory, he said compiling one disrupted operations. He offered a summary instead. He told me to trust the system. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. Settled in. One afternoon, I received an automated notice that the custodial agreement had been renewed. I hadn't signed anything new. I forwarded it to him. He replied that renewals were automatic unless terminated within a specific window. He said the window had passed while he was traveling. He said we could address it next cycle. When I asked what terminating would involve, he said reassignment required proof of continuity. He said institutions would freeze access until a new custodian was approved. He said that could take months. He said it would be damaging. I stopped asking questions that required long answers. The first time I realized I'd lost something concrete was small. A collector called me directly to ask about purchasing a piece I didn't remember authorizing for sale. I told her I'd get back to her. I called him. He said the piece had been conditionally placed. He said it was reversible. When I asked for the contract, he said it had already been executed pending final approval. He said backing out would reflect poorly. I didn't back out. That night I searched my email for my own name. It appeared less often than his. I searched the shared drive. Some folders were read-only now. Some were gone. I asked him if anything had changed. He said no. He said things were finally running the way they should. The break didn't come as a confrontation. Came as an update. He forwarded me an email from an institution I'd never worked with before. It thanked him for facilitating access to select materials and confirmed a long-term custodial partnership. Not a loan. A partnership. The language was clean. Settled. My name appeared once in the middle as origin. I asked him when this had been discussed. He said it was a continuation. He said the conversation had been ongoing for months. He said this was the natural outcome of visibility. He said nothing had been finalized without my work at the center of it. He didn't say without my consent. When I asked what exactly had been transferred, he said custody, not ownership. He said that distinction mattered legally. He said the materials would be safer housed where infrastructure existed. He said my access would be scheduled, not restricted. Scheduled. I went back to the warehouse the next morning. The code still didn't work. I didn't wait. I called the number on the door. The voicemail identified the archive by his name. He called me back an hour later. Calm. Almost relieved. He said showing up unannounced created liability. He said I couldn't do that anymore. I asked him when I'd stop being allowed to touch my own work. He paused. Not long. Just enough to register. He said it wasn't about permission. It was about process. That afternoon, a courier arrived with paperwork requiring my signature. Not for removal. For acknowledgement. It listed items already transferred under the custodial agreement. Dozens of negatives. Originals. Master files. Each one labeled with my shorthand translated into a system I hadn't designed. I asked him why I was seeing this now. He said delays caused confusion. He said clarity mattered. I signed because refusing wouldn't reverse anything. It would just mark me as non-cooperative. The deposits started changing after that. Not stopping. Dividing. Portions allocated to storage, management, facilitation. Each line item defensible. Each one small enough to ignore. Together enough to feel intentional. I tried to pull a piece from the archive for myself. A single print. Personal. Never shown. I emailed him with the request. He replied the next day. He said it was currently unavailable due to an active review cycle. He suggested an alternative from the same period. I didn't want an alternative. We stopped seeing each other entirely after that. No argument. No ending. He stayed inside the structure he'd built. I stayed outside it. When I asked him to release custody back to me, he said reassignment required an approved successor. He said I could apply. He said it would be reviewed by the institutions now relying on the archive's continuity. He said it would take time. A month later, I received a formal invitation to a private viewing of my own work. The sender was the archive. The RSVP link went to him. I didn't go. Instead, I tried to retrieve my personal boxes. The ones never digitized. The early work. The storage company told me those units were no longer registered under my name. They gave me a reference number and an email address. It was his. I sent one last message. I asked him when I could have my things back. He replied with the document. It outlined a process, steps, conditions, review periods. At the bottom was a line that said, "Unauthorized removal constitutes breach." I closed the file. That was when I understood that what I'd lost wasn't just access. It was authorship over the present tense of my own life. The last confirmation came without his name on it. It was a notification from a cataloging service I didn't subscribe to, thanking me for my submission and confirming that the archive had been indexed under an institutional profile. The contact listed was a general email. The address was the warehouse. I clicked through anyway. My work appeared clean and complete. Years mapped into timelines I hadn't drawn. Descriptions written in a voice that wasn't mine but knew what to say. The credits were accurate. The order wasn't. There was no way to comment. I tried one final thing that night. I went to the warehouse late after traffic thinned. I didn't expect the code to work. It didn't. I stood there long enough for the motion sensor to time out and the lights to go dark behind the glass. Through the window, I could see the crates stacked precisely where they'd always been. Familiar shapes. My labels. Typed now. I didn't knock. The next morning, a courier arrived at my apartment with a return shipment. One box. Light. Inside were personal effects I hadn't realized were missing. Old notebooks. Contact sheets I'd marked as non-essential. A few test prints. The things that didn't travel well. There was a packing slip. Non-archival materials. Released. That afternoon my lawyer called back. She'd reviewed the documents I'd sent. She said contesting custodianship would be expensive and slow. She said institutions had already relied on the structure. She said I'd signed away more than I'd thought, even if I'd kept ownership on paper. She asked what outcome I wanted. I didn't answer. The deposits continued. Smaller now. Clean. Predictable. Enough to suggest stability. Enough to make urgency feel irrational. I received an invitation to speak on a panel about legacy and preservation. My bio listed my work as represented by the archive. His name appeared nowhere. The structure had absorbed him too. I declined. A month later, I saw one of my images reproduced in a catalog. The credit was correct. The caption wasn't. It described intent I'd never had. It wasn't wrong enough to dispute, just wrong enough to feel permanent. I stopped opening messages addressed to the archive. I stopped correcting people when they spoke to me as if my work were finished. I stopped explaining. The final fixation was ordinary. I moved the remaining boxes out of my apartment, the ones that had never gone to storage. I labeled them plainly. I stacked them in a closet I rarely used. I didn't photograph them. I didn't inventory them. I left them where I could see them if I opened the door. They were heavier than I remembered. That night, I searched my name online and found a profile I hadn't approved. It listed my birth year, my major works, a contact email that wasn't mine. I closed the browser. In the morning, there were no notifications, no requests, no summaries. The archive was running without friction. I made coffee and stood in my kitchen holding a mug, aware of how quiet it was when nothing needed me to sign. The work still existed. The system was intact. But the part of it that required me was gone. And nothing else needed to happen for that to remain true.